In all of our lives, there are moments where, as believers, we're invited by God's Spirit into the glory of God. There are moments in every believer's life, some more frequent than others, where we have that light bulb moment, or our vision sees clearly and understands who God is, and it brings to our hearts a conclusion about what that means for the living of our life. Remember, you who are a little older, from the 60s, Dr. Martin Luther King, who always, in his work with social justice, fighting against the sin of racism in our country, the prejudice, he often would say, I have been to the mountaintop, and I have seen the Lord. And that was what gave him the power or the courage to continue what he felt God had called him to do. A profound encounter with the living God, where guilt gives way to grace. And I get it, that all the guilt that is mine because of my things that I've done in my life is washed away in the grace of Jesus. And that for the first time, or for yet again with new eyes, I see the full glory of who the Lord God is in the face of Jesus Christ, and that it gives me a sense of peace, or it gives me a sense of joy. And somehow in the knowledge of seeing who Jesus is and knowing Him, I understand who I am and what my purpose is. So we come to this story of the Transfiguration. I want to, just as a way to kind of get our brains around this, think about some superheroes in our culture. So I'm going to say the name of their disguised personality, and you tell me who it is. We'll start with an easy one. Clark Kent. Diana Prince.
Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman. All of you know that one?
Almighty Iceland.
Steve Quattlebaum knew it very well. Peter Parker. Steve Rogers. Captain America. Way to go. I'm going to tell you a very fast story about my grandson who wanted to meet Captain America, Brooks. And it just so happened that, just like Santa Claus, Captain America was in the grocery store in West Union, Iowa. Well, Brooks got him one glimpse of Captain America, his hero! And he ran as fast as he could away from him and hid. One more. Bruce Wayne.
Batman.
Okay, here's the deal, right? They live a seemingly ordinary life, but in moments where the situation requires it, their superpowers are exemplified and they rescue. Well, magnify that by 1,000,000, and you have Jesus of Nazareth. He looks like an ordinary baby, grows up looking like an ordinary boy, looks like an ordinary man, apprenticing in the carpenter shop of his father Joseph. But then there are these moments, these miracles, where some other power is very evident. Well, who is he? Again, I'm getting old, but I remember a movie from the late 70s, Oh God, that might give us insights into who Jesus was. Let's take a look at George Burns playing Oh God.
Jesus was my son. Buddha was my son. Muhammad, Moses, you, the man who said there was no room in the inn was my son. And so was the one who charged us $11 for steak and this one. Let's mush on.
Is that true? Is everybody God's son? Well, it is true by faith. But what he's saying in that made-for-Hollywood movie is any religious figure, take your pick, is the Son of God. That's not what we believe. The Word of God and the story that we're going to unpack for a few minutes together is a story of the glory radiating from the person of Jesus, who reveals him not as a Son of God, but the Son of God, above all others. How many of you have seen pictures? Maybe you've been to Rio de Janeiro. I'd like to go there someday and see the statue of Christ on top of the mountain that stands welcoming the city of Rio de Janeiro. It makes me think of that passage in Matthew 11 where Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on the mountain with him. Some say they were the inner circle. Peter was the bold, brash fisherman, impulsive, loud, opinionated. I can relate well to Peter, but I don't know if any of you remember that James and John must have also been fairly emotionally volatile, because they were called the sons of thunder. So those three boys come along with Jesus to the mountaintop, and in the middle of a time of prayer, they see the face of Jesus flash like lightning, and appear with him Moses and Elijah. Now Peter later died a martyr's death, and he said, "I can't be crucified, I'm unworthy to be crucified like my Lord." So Peter was crucified upside down for professing his faith in Jesus Christ. But in 1 Peter, he said this: "We were eyewitnesses to his majesty." So when Peter died, he didn't die for a fairy tale. We're not making this stuff up. Peter died because with his own eyes, he had seen the radiating glory of Jesus, the Son of God. Moses, you remember Moses? Floated as a baby by his mother down the Nile to spare his life. Grew up to be Prince of Egypt, but then became an outcast on the run, a criminal. Later, at a burning bush, was called by God to go back to Egypt to be the prophet that would lead God's people out of slavery, convincing Pharaoh with the 10 plagues, the last plague being the blood of the lamb smeared on the doorpost to protect them from death. But then later, in the wilderness on Mount Sinai, Moses received the law. And Elijah, do you remember anything from Sunday school class about Elijah? He was kept through a famine by the widow of Zarephath. He was fed by God's ravens by a river where he lived in a time of great famine. Later, he was called by God in fighting with Ahab and Jezebel, the king and queen of the northern kingdom, who had led God's people into idolatry, to a contest with the prophets of Baal. You remember when for hours the prophets of Baal begged for the gods to accept the sacrifice? And then when it was Elijah's turn, he poured buckets of water onto the animals of the sacrifice just to prove the power of God, and then prayed, and God received the sacrifice. And the revelation of the power of God demonstrated the authenticity that God is the Almighty. So what do Moses and Elijah and Jesus share in common? Do you know this? We don't know where any of them are laid to rest. We don't know where Moses was buried. Elijah was taken up into heaven, his body. And Jesus, though he laid in a tomb for 3 days, is raised from the dead. We can't visit their graves. Interesting, isn't it? But it says that Moses and Elijah were talking with Jesus about his departure. This is a very interesting thing. It loses something in the English, because in the Greek it says they were talking with Jesus about the Exodus. Well, in the Old Testament, the Exodus was the major saving event of God for his people, where he broke the bonds of slavery and led them into the wilderness and eventually into the promised land. God's power of deliverance set the slaves free and gave them freedom and gave them their identity as God's people. So what Moses and Elijah are talking about with Jesus is the big master plan of salvation. They're talking with Jesus about what he is going to do to fulfill the plan of God to break Laaveg slavery and set me free, to forgive my sin and to break the grip of the enemy of my soul, Satan, and to make me free and to give me identity, just as Bennett was given identity. And he's talking with his friend Frankie right up here in the front row. But to give Bennett the promise that he is son of God. He is a part of God's people. So they're talking together about this glorious plan. Because you see, the story reveals the identity of Jesus, but the real thing is what Jesus is going to do, because in a few verses in Luke 9:51, it says Jesus set his face like flint to go to Jerusalem. He was resolutely committed to go to Jerusalem and do what God asked him to do. What God needed him to do. So the hugest revelation of the glory of Jesus was not on top of the mountain of transfiguration, which most scholars think was Mount Tabor. Tabor. But that in fact it was the mountain of transfiguration that led to the mountain called Calvary. And there the full revelation of the glory of Jesus Christ was revealed like no other. Why? Because it's still the most glorious thing when God was willing, though perfect, to give his life for you and I. Where the one who is the Son of God was willing to say to you, your sins are forgiven, as his body bled out and the life is gone. The glory of Jesus is when he comes down to our level and stoops low to embrace you and me in our worst, in our weakness. Not in our glory, not in our strength, but in our weakness. When you and I are at our worst is when the glory of Jesus is most evident, where he would say to a sinner like me and a sinner like you, I love you. You belong to me. Come, follow me. That's the glory. So why the mountain of transfiguration? What was the purpose? What was Jesus trying to help us to do? I don't know if any of you are tech savvy. How many of you Twitter? All right, few of you. One brave man who admitted he Twitters. Way to go, buddy. You ever seen this? It's Jesus saying, when I said follow me, I didn't mean on Twitter. I really wanted you to follow me. So what's the purpose of the transfiguration? Jesus knows exactly where he's going. He's going to the cross. And what will it take for those who follow Jesus Christ, you and me, to follow him to the cross? It'll take courage. And it'll take this experiential encounter where it was clear to us, this one is the Son of God. So even though now he's going to endure difficulty, I know who he is. And because I know who he is, I will have the courage to follow. Barbara Brown Taylor once said this. Later, when Jesus' exodus got underway, the disciples saw what was meant for him. When they saw his shining face bloodied and spat upon, and those dazzling clothes torn into souvenir rags, they had to rethink what glory was all about. How would you define courage? Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward despite your fear. Let me say that again. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward despite what makes you afraid. John Wayne, that great theologian, said it this way. He said, courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. It means that we have the inner strength and the commitment of will to go after what we know we need to do, whatever. The Bible talks about two kinds of courage. One is an action, a bold, defining moment of activity where you act courageously. The second meaning of courage is when you endure challenge or hardship for a long period of time, where you persevere the strength of resolve. That's courage. So Jesus, I believe, gave them the mountaintop experience, revealing the fullness of His glory and power, so that the disciples would have courage downloaded into their heart to say, I'm going to follow Him. Even if He goes to the cross. Even if He dies. I'm going to follow Him. So we love the mountaintop, right? We're just like Peter. Let's just stay here. Let's just hang out. This is really good. We like those triumphant, euphoric worship moments where we sense the vivid, powerful presence of the Almighty. Have you had those moments? Those moments where it's like you're floating and your heart is praising the Lord, and it's like time is suspended and you know you're in the presence of God? We want to hang on to those moments. But the mission for us is in the valley. So here's my question to you. What is your valley? If God the Lord has revealed His glory to you, if you know and believe you are forgiven of your sins and that you belong to God, and you can't stay on the mountaintop, you got to live it in the valley. So what is your valley? Where do you need, like Jesus going to the cross, to live a self-sacrificing life of love in order to shine, to give hope into the darkness of the valley? For some people, it's a cycle of defeat. That's where they need to shine. It's a fresh resolve to not continue that cycle that repeats the bondage that you and I are stuck in, but in fact receives the light of Jesus' glory and courage and strength, so that we'll, by the Spirit's help, break that cycle of defeat and not continue to wallow in that which would hold us in bondage. For others, it's to face the valley of deep wounds, of something in our past that has left us marked, that's impacted our present and our vision of the future. Maybe somebody violated you. Maybe somebody wronged you. Maybe somebody did something to you that was so wrong that you don't know how to deal with it anymore. And you need the Spirit of Jesus to heal your inner heart, that you might not continue to deal with the deep wound that's inside you, that's affecting you. Maybe for others, the valley is to face depression. I've known people of strong faith who all their life, it's like that black cloud is a gremlin that goes over them. And every day they need the Spirit of Jesus to help them to face the valley of depression. Maybe for some it's a difficult relationship. Maybe it's in your family. Maybe you live with someone for whom life is difficult. And in sharing that relationship, that's your valley. That's where you have to say, Jesus, I know who you are, and I know you live in me, and you've got to show me how to be courageous, to shine, that I might be faithful to you, even in this relationship. Maybe it's difficult circumstances. Maybe it's disillusionment. Has life ever become so heavy for you in a comprehensive sense that you find yourself in a cloud of cynicism where you just think life stinks? Maybe your valley is facing disillusion and finding fresh hope. Or maybe, like Jesus, it's to obey the call of God to do the mission that God has asked you to do. And I don't even know what that is. But harnessing your giftedness as a child of God, the God Spirit is saying, Here's what I want you to do to build my kingdom. Here's what I want you to do to love people in my name. Here's what I want you to do to give hope to those who have lost hope. So we've been to the mountaintop, but where's your valley? See, for all of us, there's a point at which the euphoric spiritual experience becomes living in the valley to shine with Jesus' love in the context of the daily stuff, the ordinary stuff of our life, and having the courage to shine. It's going from worship to living faith. We've got to make that transition. Have you ever heard this quote? Never doubt in the dark what God has taught you in the light. Never doubt in the dark what God has taught you in the light. I just read a story this week about a group of people who were on a vacation. They were traveling on an ocean liner. But they were scared to death because the ocean liner was going up and down in turbulent seas. They all felt like they were going to lose their lunch. It was tough. But then some of the passengers snuck up to where the captain was in the control room at the helm. And they saw the face of the captain. And the captain wasn't afraid. The captain was confident. The captain was at peace. The captain was strong. And so those passengers came back and told the rest of the passengers, we're not worried anymore. We've seen the face of the captain. And all is well. All is well. That's how you and I go in the valley. I don't know what your valley is, but I know the Spirit calls you to leave worship together and go live the faith, to shine for Jesus Christ. This week we laid to rest a dear saint as a part of Faith Lutheran, Sherry Clark. Some of you who weren't at the funeral may not know that for the last few months of Sherry's life, she woke with vivid dreams or visions of Jesus radiating, kind of like that statue outside Rio de Janeiro, of Jesus radiating in light and glory and love with his arms stretched out to her. And when the last days of her life were unfolding, and she knew that it seemed God was not going to heal her this side of heaven, she came to say, I think God was teaching me how to die. Pretty cool. A vivid of the glory of Jesus that helps us to know how to run to the arms of Christ, to have the courage to die. So here's what I want you to know when you leave worship today. All is well, for Jesus Christ is the captain. Your life is in the arms of the glorious, all-powerful Son of God. The Son of God. Not a Son of God. But the one who was faithful to you and me to go to the cross and be raised from the dead. To give you and I the victory so that we can go to the valley and be faithful.